The Duke of Blackmere did not look at his wife. He never did. At the long dining table, candlelight flickered across crystal glasses and polished silver, and Serafina sat at the far end, a ghost dressed in silk. The first course had been served, the soup a delicate golden consommé, yet her husband's gaze remained fixed somewhere above her left shoulder, as though she were part of the furniture. She had dressed carefully tonight, a deep green gown that brought out the copper threads in her dark hair, pearls at her throat, a quiet hope burning in her chest. That hope had already begun to wither. Lord and Lady Pemberton were visiting, old family friends, and Lady Pemberton kept glancing at Serafina with something between pity and curiosity. The conversation flowed around hunting and Parliament and the new stallion in the Blackmere stables. Serafina had tried twice to contribute, her voice soft but steady. The first time Lucian had simply continued speaking. The second time he had lifted his wineglass and said, without turning his head, "The venison is overdone. Please see to it the cook is informed." Not to her, to the footman. The silence that followed was a living thing. Lady Pemberton coughed delicately. Serafina's cheeks burned, but she kept her spine straight. She had been the Duchess of Blackmere for 11 months, and in that time she had learned to hide her humiliation behind a mask of porcelain calm. But that night something inside her cracked. Not loudly, not visibly, just a small, clean fracture like a hairline break in a teacup. She set her spoon down and excused herself before the dessert course, murmuring something about a headache. No one tried to stop her. Lucian's fork did not pause. As she walked through the shadowed corridor toward her chambers, her slippers whispering on the cold stone floor, she pressed her hand against her ribcage. The familiar flutter was there, a skittering rhythm beneath her breast, her heart. The physician had called it a nervous weakness, a condition brought on by strain or strong emotion. She had never told Lucian. Why would she? He had married a debt, not a woman. And a debt did not have a fragile heart. Their marriage had been arranged with the efficiency of a business transaction. The Vane family owed an astronomical sum to the crown, the result of her late father's disastrous investments and her brother's gambling. Blackmere had paid every penny within a week of the contract being signed. In return, Serafina became the Duchess of Blackmere, a bride acquired to secure a political alliance that would strengthen Blackmere's standing with certain factions in the House of Lords. There had been no courtship. No stolen glances. On their wedding day, Lucian had stood beside her at the altar like a man carved from winter stone. He had lifted her veil with impersonal hands and placed a cold kiss upon her forehead. He had not spoken her name that day, nor on the carriage ride to his vast, wind-scoured estate in the north. In fact, she could count on one hand the times he had addressed her directly. She was the Duchess to his staff, my wife when required by protocol and nothing at all when they were alone. The first week she had tried to reach him. She had learned his preferences for tea, had requested his favorite books from the library, had worn a gown in the deep blue shade he was rumored to admire. He had glanced at her once, his silver-gray eyes unreadable, and then left the room without a word. She had stood there holding a tray of tea things, feeling foolish and young and terribly, terribly alone. By the 3rd month she stopped trying. By the 6th month she had stopped crying into her pillow. By the 9th month she had discovered the old dower house on the edge of the estate, a forgotten cottage covered in ivy, and there she had found her escape, not in brooding or bitterness but in paint. No one at Blackmere knew that Serafina Vane, the invisible Duchess, was an artist of quiet brilliance. In the dusty parlor of the dower house, she had set up an easel and a collection of oil paints, smuggled in from the village by a sympathetic maid named Bess. Serafina painted landscapes at first, wild moorlands under bruised skis, the roiling sea near the cliffs. Then she began painting the faces of the village children, the old fishermen, the women who sold flowers in the market square. She sold the paintings under the name S. Vane, funneling the modest profits to a foundling home on the outskirts of Blackmere village. The home was a crumbling, underfunded place run by a determined widow named Mrs. Holly. Serafina visited twice a week, bringing bread, coins, and a quiet warmth that the children came to love. There, she was not the neglected Duchess. She was Lady Sira, the kind woman who mended torn sleeves and listened to little ones recite their letters. It was in that small, drafty building that she began to breathe again, but she never forgot the fracture. The hurt lived just beneath the surface, a bruise that never quite healed. One evening in late October, a grand ball was held at Blackmere Castle to celebrate the harvest. Nobility from 3 counties attended, their carriages clogging the drive, the great hall blazing with candlelight and music. Serafina wore a gown of deep russet silk, her hair dressed with amber pins. She looked beautiful and she knew it. But she no longer dressed for Lucian's gaze. She dressed for herself. The Duke stood near the marble fireplace, speaking with Lord Rexley and a cluster of political allies. When Serafina entered, a few guests turned. She caught murmured words, "Exquisite, such a pity, he barely acknowledges her." She smiled politely, gliding through the crowd like water, stopping to speak with the vicar's wife, with a young baronet who stammered compliments, with an elderly countess who patted her hand and said, "You hold yourself well, my dear, better than most." And then, because the universe sometimes delivered small mercies, the doors opened and she saw him, not Lucian. Mr. Nathaniel Thorne, the Blackmere estate steward, a man of perhaps 30, with kind hazel eyes and hands calloused from honest work. He had helped her on several occasions, arranging discreet deliveries to the foundling home, never asking questions, simply offering quiet support. He caught her eye across the room and inclined his head with a small smile. Serafina smiled back. It was the most natural, unforced smile she had given all evening. Across the room, Lucian's fingers tightened around his glass. He did not know why. The sight of his wife speaking easily with a man in a steward's plain coat should not have stirred anything, but it did. A faint, unwelcome prickle beneath his sternum. He looked away, but he looked again. The dance floor filled. Serafina did not expect to dance. She rarely did, but Nathaniel Thorne, with an apologetic bow, asked if her grace would honor him with a quadrille. It was bold. It was perhaps improper. But she saw no pity in his eyes, only friendly invitation. She accepted. They danced and she laughed when he misstepped, and the sound of her laughter drifted across the hall like a melody. Lucian heard it. His jaw tightened. The laughter stopped only when a sudden, sharp pain lanced through Serafina's chest. She faltered mid-step, pressing a hand to her ribs. The familiar flutter became a rapid, desperate pounding, her vision swimming for a terrifying heartbeat. Nathaniel caught her elbow. "Your Grace, are you unwell?" She forced a smile, breathing slowly, willing her heart to settle. A momentary dizziness, the heat of the room. It passed, it always passed, but it left her pale, and the steward guided her gently to a chair by the terrace doors. Lucian saw that too. He saw his wife, pale and shaken, leaning on another man's arm. And something twisted inside him, something possessive and ugly. He crossed the room in long, deliberate strides, and guests parted before him like wheat before a scythe. When he reached Serafina, Nathaniel immediately stepped back, bowing. "Your Grace," the Duchess felt faint. "I was merely assisting." Lucian's voice was ice. "I can see that. You may go." Serafina looked up at her husband. For the first time in months, his silver eyes were on her, truly on her. But what she saw there was not concern. It was cold irritation. "You should not push yourself in front of guests," he said, too low for others to hear. "It reflects poorly." The fracture inside her widened. She rose, her legs steady now, her heart a dull ache. "I apologize, Your Grace. I would not wish to embarrass you." She curtsied with perfect form and left the ballroom without looking back. That night, in the solitude of her bedchamber, Serafina sat by the window and watched the moon hang low over the moor. She touched her chest, feeling the erratic rhythm that still lurked, a tiny bird trapped in her ribs. The physician had warned her to avoid excitement, to avoid strain. But how did one avoid a broken heart when it beat inside one's own body? She pulled out a small leather journal and began to write. Not a diary. Letters. Unsent letters to a husband who would never read them. She had been writing them for months, ever since that first crack at the dinner table. They contained everything she could not say. Tonight she wrote, "I danced tonight, and for a moment I forgot that I am invisible. I forgot that my name is a silent thing in your mouth. But my heart remembered, it always remembers. The pain is not in my chest, Lucian. It is in the space where you should be." She blotted the ink, closed the journal, and hid it beneath a loose floorboard. Then she went asleep, alone in the wide, cold bed. The following weeks brought a visible change to the Duchess of Blackmere. She no longer haunted the corners of the castle, waiting for scraps of attention. She rose early each morning and rode to the village in a plain carriage, spending hours at the foundling home. She organized a small fundraising bazaar, charming the local gentry with a grace that surprised them all. She painted furiously in the dower house, filling canvas after canvas, and sent them to a gallery in York under her pseudonym. A few sold for handsome sums. The money fed the children, repaired the leaking roof, and bought new shoes. Mrs. Holly called her an angel. The village began to speak of the Duchess with genuine affection. At the castle, the servants noticed the change too. The master's wife no longer asked after the Duke's schedule. She no longer lingered in the library hoping he might wander in. She stopped wearing the blue he favored and instead dressed in rich autumnal colors that suited her warm complexion. She laughed more easily with Bess, her maid, and with the gardener's boy who brought her wildflowers. She was becoming whole not because of her marriage but in spite of it. Lucian noticed the silence, her silence. It had a different texture now. Before, her quiet had been hopeful, expectant, a held breath waiting for a reply. Now it was a settled stillness, as though she had already closed a book he had never bothered to open. She ate breakfast before he came down. She no longer appeared in the corridor when he returned from his daily rides. She answered his rare, perfunctory questions with polite, short replies that left no room for continuation. She was perfectly courteous, perfectly distant. It unnerved him more than he wanted to admit. One afternoon, Lucian rode past the dower house and saw smoke curling from the chimney. He had thought the old cottage abandoned. Curious, he dismounted and approached the window. What he saw stopped him cold. Seraphina stood before an easel, her hair tied back with a simple ribbon, a paintbrush in her hand. Her gown was smudged with color, her brow furrowed in concentration. On the canvas was a portrait of a little girl, one of the foundlings, her eyes wide and luminous, her smile missing a tooth. It was astonishingly good, alive. He had no idea she could paint. He stood there, hidden in the ivy, watching her for a long moment. The expression on her face was one he had never seen directed at him, a quiet, absorbed joy. Then her hand faltered. The brush clattered to the floor. She pressed both palms to her chest and bent forward, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Lucian's heart lurched. He nearly burst through the door, but she straightened after a few seconds, shaking her head as if scolding her own body. She picked up the brush and continued, her face pale but composed. He withdrew silently, his mind churning. Something was wrong with her, something she was hiding, and the realization that she would rather suffer in secrecy than confide in him struck him like a physical blow. The emotional landscape of Blackmere shifted the evening of the bazaar. The village green was strung with lanterns, stalls selling everything from spiced cider to knitted shawls. Seraphina moved among the crowd, her cheeks pink from the cold, a basket over her arm. Nathaniel Thorne was at her side, helping her carry a crate of donated books. They worked together with an easy camaraderie that did not go unnoticed. Lady Pemberton, visiting again, tittered to a friend about the Duchess and the handsome steward. The words reached Lucian's ears. He stood near the ale tent, his presence dark as a thundercloud. He watched his wife smile at Thorne. He watched the steward lean close to whisper something that made her laugh. The sound was light, free, a sound Lucian had never drawn from her. Something hot and sharp rose in his throat. Jealousy. He recognized it now, fully formed, clawing at his insides. He had no right to feel it. He had given her nothing but cold duty and colder silence. Yet the sight of another man basking in her warmth, the warmth that should have been his, was unbearable. He turned away, his jaw clenched, and rode back to the castle alone. That night he did something he had not done in years. He poured himself a brandy and sat in the dark, thinking of all the times she had looked at him with those hopeful, soft brown eyes, of the tea tray she had prepared, the blue gown she had worn, the little attempts at conversation he had crushed with his indifference. And he thought of her painting, her hidden talent, her secret pain. He felt the unfamiliar sting of guilt. No, more than guilt, regret. a deep, hollow regret that opened a pit beneath his feet. The days that followed were tense. Lucian tried, in his own clumsy, emotionally illiterate way, to bridge the distance. He appeared at breakfast, only to find she had already eaten. He sent a footman to inquire if she required anything for her artistic pursuits. The message she returned was polite. Her Grace thanks the Duke but requires nothing. He left a book of poetry on her vanity, a volume of Keats he remembered her mentioning months ago. She did not acknowledge it. Not out of pettiness, but because she had genuinely stopped expecting anything from him. Her heart had built a protective wall, and she was too exhausted to tear it down again. The letters in her hidden journal grew more melancholic. I think I have finally learned to live without you. It feels like a small death every day, but I am breathing. The children need me. The paint dries and I exist. Perhaps that is enough. Then came the storm. It swept in from the sea on a black November afternoon, wind howling like a wounded beast, rain slashing sideways. Seraphina had been at the foundling home, reading to the children, when Mrs. Holly pulled her aside with a worried face. One of the boys, little Toby, had wandered off toward the cliffs that morning and had not returned. The child was 8 years old, prone to daydreams, and the weather was turning deadly. Without hesitation, Seraphina wrapped herself in a heavy cloak and strode out into the gale. She could not sit warm and safe while a child was lost. She searched the cliff path, her voice torn away by the wind, her heart laboring with every step. The pain came in sharp, rhythmic stabs, but she pushed on, gripping rocks, calling Toby's name. She found him at last, huddled in a shallow cave near the base of the cliff, soaked and shivering. She pulled the boy into her arms, wrapping her cloak around him, and began the treacherous climb back. Halfway up, her heart gave a violent, irregular spasm. Her vision grayed. She stumbled, clutching the child tighter, and collapsed on the muddy path just as a search party from the estate reached them. Nathaniel Thorne was there, and the head groom and several villagers. They carried her back to the castle, shouting for a physician. Lucian was in his study when the doors burst open. The steward, drenched and wild-eyed, spoke 3 words that shattered his world. The Duchess collapsed. He ran. Through corridors, up staircases, his heart a frantic drum. He burst into her chambers to find the physician already there, her maid weeping in the corner, and Seraphina lying motionless on the bed, her face as white as the pillow beneath her head. The physician's expression was grave. "It is her heart, Your Grace. A congenital weakness exacerbated by strain and cold. She is stable for now, but she must not exert herself. I have warned her before, she is fragile." Lucian grabbed the man's arm, his voice a rasp. She knew she was ill, and she went out into a storm. Bess, the maid, spoke up through her tears. "She always said there was no point burdening anyone, Your Grace. She said she would not trouble the Duke with her weakness." Lucian's legs nearly buckled. He sank onto the edge of the bed and took her cold, limp hand in his. For the first time in his life, his eyes burned with unshed tears. She had been carrying this terror alone, month after month, while he had treated her like a stranger, while he had made her feel invisible. He pressed her fingers to his lips and whispered a single word, ragged and broken: "Stay." She did not wake for 2 days. He did not leave her side. He slept in the chair by her bed, ate nothing, spoke to no one. The staff looked upon their master and saw a man undone. On the second night, while she still slept, he found the loose floorboard. He had been packing, restless, and his boot had caught the edge. The journal tumbled out, its leather cover worn soft. He should not have opened it, but he did. He read every unsent letter, every unspoken truth, every quiet declaration of love she had buried. And when he reached the final entry, written the morning before the storm, his tears fell unashamed. "If I die, I want you to know one thing. I loved you from the very first moment. At the Emerson ball 5 years ago, before my family fell into ruin, before any of this. You were standing by the window and the moonlight caught your profile, and I thought, there is my heart walking outside my body. You never looked at me that night. You never looked at me after. But I have loved you in silence for half a decade, and I will love you until my heart finally, mercifully stops." The date was the night before she nearly drowned on a cliff to save a child. He closed the journal with shaking hands and wept. She woke to the sound of his voice. It was strange because she had rarely heard it directed at her with such raw emotion. Serafina, her name, he had spoken her name. She turned her head weakly on the pillow and saw him, haggard and unshaven, his silver eyes red-rimmed. He was holding her hand as if it were made of spun glass. "You called me by my name," she whispered. A ghost of a smile touched his cracked lips. "I have been a fool, Sira, a blind, arrogant fool. I have called you nothing when I should have called you my world." She blinked, confused, her mind still foggy. "I don't understand." He knelt beside the bed, bringing her knuckles to his forehead. "I was afraid. From the beginning I was afraid. I saw you at that ball, 5 years past, and I thought you were the most beautiful creature I had ever seen. I was about to ask for an introduction when I overheard you laughing with your friends. One of them teased you about a certain young lord, and you blushed and said, 'I could never love a man so cold.' I thought you meant me. I have a cold demeanor, everyone says so. And I, a proud fool, retreated before I could be rejected. When your family fell and the alliance was proposed, I agreed because I wanted you, even if you could never want me. But I kept my distance. I protected myself. I never gave you a chance because I was terrified of seeing that rejection in your eyes. So I made you invisible. I made you pay for a fear that was never your fault." Serafina stared at him, the tears slipping down her temples into her hair. All this time, all this aching, wasted time. A misunderstanding born of pride and fear. She would have laughed if it didn't hurt so much. "I was talking about Lord Pembleton," she breathed. "The one with the lizard collection. He had proposed to my cousin, and I said I could never love a man so cold to insects. It was a joke, a silly, stupid joke." Lucian's face crumpled. A strangled sound escaped him, half laugh, half sob. "A lizard collection. Yes, I destroyed us over a lizard collection." They looked at each other, and the absurd tragedy of it hung between them, a fragile, terrible thing. Then he leaned forward and pressed the gentlest kiss to her forehead, her eyelids, the corner of her mouth. Not demanding, offering. "I have loved you too late," he murmured against her skin. "But I am here. I am so desperately here. Please, Sira, stay with me. Let me spend the rest of my life learning your name in every language, saying it until you are deaf to everything else." Her recovery was slow, but it was filled with a tenderness neither had known existed. He brought her breakfast on a tray, clumsily arranged with wildflowers from the greenhouse. He read to her from the Keats she had ignored, his deep voice stumbling over the poetry. He sat beside her while she painted, this time in a sunlit room he had prepared for her himself, with the best canvases money could buy. He went with her to the foundling home, carrying sacks of flour on his aristocratic shoulders, and the children climbed him like a tree. They saw him smile for the first time, and Serafina's heart, though still weak, began to heal in a way that had nothing to do with medicine. The rhythm steadied. The pain became a distant memory. One evening in spring, months later, they stood together on the cliff path where she had almost died. The sea glittered below, and the air smelled of salt and new grass. He wrapped his coat around her shoulders and drew her close. "I have something for you," he said, and placed into her hands a small leather journal, identical to the one she had hidden. She opened it. It was filled with his handwriting. Letters, dozens of letters to her. Confessions, poems, memories, promises. Every single one began the same way: "My dearest Serafina." She looked up at him, her eyes shining. "You wrote me letters. I wanted to give you back every word you ever gave me. And I wanted to begin a new conversation, one that never ends." She closed the journal and pressed her face into his chest, listening to the steady, strong beat beneath his waistcoat. "Then tell me now," she said. "What is the first word?" He cupped her face, tilting it gently toward the sunset. "Your name," he said. "Always your name, Serafina." And the wind carried it out over the sea, a sound that was no longer silent, no longer invisible, a sound that was at long last loved. The foundling home thrived. The Duchess's paintings became celebrated, her health managed with careful rest and joy. And the Duke of Blackmere, once a man of ice, became known for the warmth in his eyes whenever his wife entered a room. Their love had been forged through a storm, but it held, steady and true, against any weather the world could bring. And every night, before they slept, he would say her name into the darkness, and she would answer, and the silence between them was finally filled with everything they had almost lost.